Welcome again, dear students. Today's lecture is the continuation of the lecture on federalism in India and Canada. Federalism in India we have already discussed in the part 1 of this lecture. So, in this lecture we will focus on functioning of federalism in Canada. The lecture will also try to see various characteristics of federalism that can be found in the Canadian Constitution. This lecture will also analyze the decentralization of powers in Canada. And finally, this lecture will highlight the challenges to the working of federalism in India and Canada. Canada is one of the oldest federations in the world. Canada became a federation in 1867, which makes it the third oldest federation in the world today, after the United States and Switzerland. While the term confederation is often used by Canadians when referring to the Union of 1867, the term actually refers to the process of bringing the provinces together into a federation rather than the adoption of a confederal structure. Federalism in Canada is a reflection of its unique geography and history. It is a large country, second only to Russia in territorial size, but it has a relatively small population of approximately 32 million people. The composition of that population has also changed since Confederation. In 1867, Canada was primarily a mix of English and French colonists. The first settlers from France arrived in 1604. Today, the Canadian population includes individuals from virtually every country in the world. Notwithstanding this, a French-speaking majority has endured within one province, Quebec. About 80% of the French-Canadian population lives in Quebec, where they constitute over 80% of the population. A federal system reconciles a desire for overall unity with a desire for regional autonomy. A country with a federal system has independent national and regional governments, each operating theoretically at least in its own discrete jurisdictional area. Such is the case in Canada. Political power is shared by two orders of government, the federal government on the one hand and the provincial governments on the other. Within their defined spheres of jurisdiction, the two orders are equal. There is no superior subordinate relationship. The distinct functions of the provincial legislatures and of the Parliament of Canada were established in the British North American Act, which was later renamed the Constitution Act of 1867. Like both the United States and the United Kingdom, Canada has bicameral legislature, which is composed of the House of Commons and the Senate. However, the Canadian Senate bears more resemblance to the United Kingdom's House of Lords than it does the United States Senate. Its members are appointed rather than elected, and it is dominated by the House of Commons. In addition, rather than each province having an equal number of senators, as in the United States model, the Canadian Constitution specifies the number of senators that are to come from each province. In Canada, Senate representation is based on regions instead of constituent units. This was done to ensure that Canada's linguistic minority, concentrated primarily in Quebec, was adequately represented. Canada has a parliamentary system like that of the United Kingdom, rather than a congressional one like that the United States. This means that in Canada, the executive functions are divided between a formal executive, that is the Governor General, and a political executive, that is the Prime Minister and his cabinet. In a congressional system, the President acts as Chief of State, head of government, and leader of a major political party. In contrast, the Prime Minister is not Canada's Chief of State. This function is entrusted to the Governor General. Formal executive power in Canada is vested in the Crown, and in a formal sense, Canada has a monarchic form of government. But while the Governor General theoretically exercises all of the rights and privileges of the Queen in right of Canada, the real power is actually exercised by the Prime Minister and his cabinet. Executive decisions made by the Prime Minister and his cabinet are, in effect, rubber stamped by the Governor General. In fact, it's a very well established convention that the Governor General acts only on the advice of government of the day. A parliament system is based on the principle of fusion of executive and legislative powers. Whichever party has a majority of seats in the legislature also controls the executive branch. Thus, the same political leaders operate both the executive and legislative branches of government. This bridge between the legislative and executive parts of the government is the cabinet, which is collectively responsible to the legislature for its action and retains office only so long as it receives majority support in the legislature. While a parliamentary system is marked by this fusion of powers, a congressional system, on the other hand, is characterized by the separation of powers. Each branch of government acts independent from others. The government of the Canadian provinces mirrors that of the national government. At the provincial level, the executive is split between a premier and the lieutenant governor. However, the provinces are no longer bicameral. They have all abolished their senates. Canada is, of course, a democratic state. The relationship between democracy and federalism means that in Canada, there may be different and equally legitimate majorities in different provinces and territories as well as at the federal level. No one majority is more or less legitimate than the others as an expression of democratic opinion. Different provinces are able to pursue specific policies that respond to the particular concerns of the people in that province. At the same time, federalism allows Canadians to achieve their goals on a national scale through federal government, acting within the limits of its jurisdiction. Canadian federalism enables citizens to participate concurrently in different collectivities and to pursue goals at both a provincial and a federal level. The various characteristics of federalism can be found in the Canadian Constitution. Now, the first characteristic of federalism that is found in Canadian Constitution is that it's written and rigid constitution. Now, the Constitution Act 1867, also known as British North American Act 1867, passed by the British Parliament, introduced a parliamentary form of government with a federal system in Canada. The amendment process of the Canadian Constitution has evolved over a period of time. The 1867 Act had no formula to amend the Constitution. The Canadian Parliament used to request the British Parliament to decide whether the amendment was to be done. In 1949, the Canadian Parliament was given the power to amend some parts of the Constitution. According to the Canada Act 1982, the Canadian Constitution can be amended in 5 ways. First, provisions affecting the federal government can be amended by the federal parliament. Second, provinces have exclusive power to amend the constitution of the province. Third, few amendments also require the approval of 2/3 of provinces containing the majority of the population. It's also referred to as the 7/50 procedure. Fourth, other amendments require the federal consent and the approval of all states, that's mentioned in section 41. And finally, fifth, Parliament's amendment affecting only one or more but not all states require approval from the concerned states only. The amendment process of Canadian Constitution affecting federal structure can be regarded as rich. Now, the second feature of federal structure is that it's having bicameral legislature. Now, Canada's federal legislature, called Parliament, is bicameral. It consists of the Queen and the 2 chambers, namely the Senate, the upper chamber, and the House of Commons, the lower chamber. The Senate represents the provinces. Initially, the Senate had 71 members. However, presently it has 104 members. The membership can be expanded up to 118. Out of 104, 4 regions of the Canadian Federation, namely Ontario, Western Provinces, Quebec, and the Maritime Provinces, send 24 representatives each to the Senate. 2 senators represent each of the Northwest Territories and Yukon. As per the Constitution of 1867, Australia, Canada, and India, House of Commons was 181-membered chamber. Nevertheless, now the membership of the House has been extended up to 282. The third feature is that there is a division of power. There is an explicit system of division of power in Canada. The Constitution Act 1867 is the primary source of division of powers in Canadian Federation. Under Section 91 and 92, Clause 10 of the Constitution, the federal government has the power to make laws on items of national interest, such as national defense, foreign affairs, employment, insurance, banking, federal taxes, the post offices, fisheries, shipping, railways, telephones and pipelines, indigenous lands and rights, and criminal law. Similarly, under Section 92 and 92 Clause A and 93, the provincial governments can make laws on local items like direct taxes, hospitals, prisons, education, marriage, property, and civil rights. In the concurrent list, the Canadian Constitution enumerates items like agriculture, old age pension, and immigration. In case of inconsistency under Section 95, the federal law will prevail on agriculture and immigration, while under Section 94, Clause A, provincial laws will prevail in the case of the old age pension. The residual powers rests with the federal parliament. It implies that powers not listed in the province list will go to the federal parliament. Now, other feature is the dispute settlement mechanism. Before 1949, the power to interpret the Constitution was vested with the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. Since then, the interpretive power has been handed over to the Supreme Court of Canada. Contrary to the centralist intentions of many constitution makers, in its constitutional interpretation, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council favored provincial autonomy between the 1880s and 1930. However, the situation changed after 1949, when the Supreme Court of Canada became the highest judiciary of Canada. The Supreme Court seems to favor the strong federal government. Two tiers of government. Like other federal states, Canada has two levels of government called federal and provincial. The Lieutenant Governor acts as Crown's representative. If Prime Minister functions as the head of the government at the federal level, the premiers exercise the executive power at the provincial level. In provinces, there also exists a cabinet and ministers. Like the federal government, states have their legislature, executive, and judiciary. Initially, the legislature of the four provinces was bicameral. At present, they are single-chambered and elected by people. The size of the provincial legislatures varies as Prince Edward Island has only 27-member legislature, while Quebec has 125-member legislature. In Canada, the system of federalism is described by the division of powers between the federal parliament and the country's provincial governments. Now, coming to the levels of government. Now, Canadian federalism has two constitutionally recognized levels of government, federal and provincial. The country also has two forms of governments, territorial and local, which are not constitutionally recognized. Now, this section we are going to introduce each level of government and its status within Canada's federal framework. The first constitutionally recognized level of government is the federal or national government. This level is responsible for enacting and implementing laws for the whole country. In doing so, the federal government is provided with its own constitutional powers and jurisdictions, which it may exercise independently from the provincial level of the government. Canada's located in Ottawa, the nation's capital, is the premier institution of the federal government. It consists of the monarchy and his or her federal representative, the Governor General, and two legislative chambers, the House of Commons and the Senate. The head of the state for the federal government is the monarchy. However, his or her role is primarily ceremonial under Canada's contemporary system of government. The bulk of federal power lies with the federal head of government and his or her executive council, which are officially referred to as the Prime Minister and Cabinet, as well as the elected legislative chamber, the House of Commons. The second federal legislature, the Senate, is an appointed body and exercises considerably less power relative to the elected House of Commons. Another key federal institution is this includes the Supreme Court of Canada, which is appointed by the federal government and is the highest court in the country. Other important federal level courts include the Federal Court of Appeal, the Federal Court, the Tax Court of Canada, the Court Martial Appeal Court, and the Courts Martial. The later two are military courts. Another important federal institution is this. This includes all of the federal government departments. This includes all of the federal government departments and agencies which are responsible for helping the federal government form and implement policy within its jurisdiction. Provincial governments form the second constitutionally recognized level of government in Canada. There are 10 provinces in Canada, each with their own provincial government. British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, Newfoundland, and Labrador, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. These provincial governments enact and implement laws within their particular provincial territory and are provided with their own constitutionally recognized powers, which they may exercise independently from the federal government and from each other. Each provincial government has its own legislative assembly, which is located in its respective provincial capital. The monarchy, or his or her provincial representative, is the provincial head of the state. However, as is the case at the federal level, this office is primarily ceremonial. Real provincial power lies instead in the hands of the provincial heads of the government and their executive councils and the provincial elected legislature. There is also a provincial level court system, which includes, and these courts are inferior to the Federal Supreme Court of Canada, and typically hear criminal, constitutional, civil, family, traffic, and bylaw cases. In addition, each province has its own, which includes government departments and agencies that are responsible for assisting their respective governments in forming and implementing policies within provincial jurisdictions. Canada also has 3 territories, each with their own territorial governments: the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. Like these provincial counterparts, these are regional governments which are responsible for enacting and implementing laws within their particular territorial area. Unlike the provinces, however, territories are not constitutionally recognized entities with their own autonomous powers and jurisdictions. Instead, the territories fall under the legislative jurisdiction of the federal government, whom is responsible for creating territories and setting out their basic framework. The head of state is a territorial which performs many of the same roles as provincial lieutenant governor. As is the case with provincial and federal governments, however, real power lies in the hands of territorial head of governments and his or her executive council, as well as the elected legislative assembly. Each territory has a public service and court system. As territories are not constitutionally recognized as autonomous governments, their status within the Canadian federalism is technically inferior. As such, territories do not have a legal say in constitutional amendments regarding the separation of powers between the federal and provincial levels of government. Nevertheless, it is common practice to include territorial governments in intergovernmental meetings and decision-making processes. The final type of government in Canada is local government, which includes municipal, county or parish, and semi-regional councils, boards, and agencies. Like the territories, local governments are not constitutionally recognized entities within their own autonomous powers and jurisdiction. Instead, local governments fall under the jurisdiction of the provinces and territories, which are responsible for creating local governments and setting out there. Now let's discuss challenge to the working of federalism in India and Canada. The working of federalism always faces challenges, particularly in the countries like Canada and India, which entertain huge diversity. Both these countries have their part of challenges. Some of these challenges we are going to discuss now. Challenge to Canadian federalism. Now, firstly, the challenges of Aboriginal people. Before the European immigration, Canada was inhabited by the Aboriginal people, the First Nations. Among these were Ojibwe, Cree, Algonquin, Blackfoot, Nisga's, Inuit, etc. These nations had different religions, languages, cultures, and polities. With white immigrations came the French, the Anglo-Saxons, and the other Europeans. Along with them came a handful of black slaves, Chinese, Japanese, Indians, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Africans, Caribbean people, etc. Now, the second challenge is new immigrants. After World War II, as Europe recovered, the immigrations from Europe drastically declined, even though Canada invited more white immigrants. Prime Minister Lester Pearson grasped the seriousness of the problem and opened up immigration from non-white countries by eliminating the quota system and introducing the merit-based point system. The latter opened up opportunities to the non-white who were educated, skilled, moneyed, or sponsored. Thus, over 300 years, Canadian society evolved from a multicultural to a white nation and then into a multicultural state. The non-whites today constitute almost 30% of the entire Canadian population. The third challenge is multicultural policy. The influx of non-whites naturally both many white citizens of Canada who express their racism in many direct and indirect ways. The Pearson government, again anticipating trouble, appointed a royal commission, which came to be known as an bicultural B&B commission. Interestingly enough, the B&B Commission produced reports that advocated not only the policy of bilingualism but also the policy of multiculturalism. The first law to enshrine multiculturalism as state policy was passed by the Canadian Parliament. Fourth challenge is French nationalism. Originally, the French citizens constituted a majority of the Canadian population. Before long, the French ratio was reduced to 30%. At present, it is about 25%. The falling ratio became a matter of concern for the French province because allocation of federal funds, subsidies, and grants is based on population. That also reduced accordingly was the voting power that decreases the political power. So historically, the French Canadian population has been concentrated in the province of Quebec, though some 10% are in other Canadian provinces. Thus, ethnicity and territoriality became merged, giving a special status to the French province that developed ethno-territorial nationalism. Thus, French nationalism developed distinct features, separating it from Canadian nationalism. The French nationalists demanded a distinct status and a special status for Quebec. The separatists refer to these as the soft nationalists who have been frustrating the separatist goal. Now let's come to the challenges to Indian federalism. Now firstly, there is diversity from ancient till modern times. Over the last 4,000 years, different civilizations, race, religion, languages, cultures have built and sustained continuous multiculturalism in India. Today, more than 1 billion people represent all the major races, religions, and cultures of the world. There are more than 2,000 languages in India. Constitution officially recognizes 18 languages. India contains the biggest Hindu and Zoroastrian population in the world, the second biggest Muslim population, and the biggest Christian population of Asia. Besides, thousands of Jews who never faced anti-Semitism in India. Many Europeans and their descendants have made India their home, have married Indians, and have become Indianized. Some of them even participated in India's freedom struggle like Annie Besant, and some became pioneers in social services like the Albanian Mother Teresa. Now coming to the challenges, the challenge again is the secessionist movements in India. Separatists and secessionist movements have also raised their ugly head in India. Before Indian independence, the partition of the country was demanded. Encouraged by the British Raj, the Muslim League demanded the creation of Pakistan, a separate state to be carved out of India and to be based on Muslim majority provinces. In the post-independent India, demands for ethnic linguistic divisions of the country also arose. Unrest started in South India, where secessionism was threatened. Similar secessionism arose in northeast India, in the Punjab and in Jammu and Kashmir. Prime Minister Nehru had the democratic mentality and far-sightedness to see the trouble brewing. He set up the States Reorganization Commission to devise a scheme for the reorganization of the constituent states. A wholesale redrawing of the political map of India was undertaken through political diplomacy, popular votes, and public accommodation. This drastic scheme was both bold and unique, ever undertaken in any democracy through peaceful method. Now let's conclude. Federalism has proved a valuable mechanism for power sharing and conflict management in diverse, plural, and large societies. The origin, type, and functioning of federalism have taken distinctive forms and paths in different states depending on situations. All defining characteristics are not found in every federation. However, a written and rigid constitution, division of power, bicameral legislature, the existence of dispute settlement mechanism, and two-tier of government have been found in every state. Although these characteristics are found in every state, the degree of rigidity of the constitution, distribution of powers between national and provinces, the principles of the representation of states in the federal legislature and functioning of the dispute settlement mechanism varies from state to state. The functioning of federalism has changed over a period. Different factors like ruling parties and ideology have affected the functioning of federalism. As a consequence of changing role of ruling parties, decisions of the courts and ideology, the functioning of the national and provincial governments, federalism has taken distinct forms and patterns such as quasi-federalism, cooperative federalism, bargaining federalism, and competitive federalism. The forces of centralization and decentralization have been competing for overall federal states. Canadian federalism has evolved from conflictual to interdependence phase via cooperation and constructive engagement phase. Indian federalism has evolved from cooperative federalism to competitive federalism via bargaining federalism. So dear students, this was all about the federalism in Canada and the challenges that the federalism faces in India and Canada. I hope you have understood it. Thanks.